Hey everybody, it's Professor Parsons here coming to you from my child's playroom, and I'm going to be recording some videos on free will, and this will correspond to a couple of PowerPoints that I've posted online as well. But for now, let's go ahead and get started. So, one of the main debates in free will, or one of the main distinctions rather, is this distinction between freedom of choice on the one hand and freedom of action on the other. So, when we're talking about freedom of choice, all we're talking about is how any individual is mentally at any given time. So, your ability to have freedom of choice just concerns your ability to mentally deliberate between rival desires or rival courses of action, and then mentally to give assent to one over the other. So, technically, if I were paralyzed from the neck down, I can still freely choose to walk, even though I cannot freely walk. In order to freely choose to walk, I have to just be able to give mentally assent to the proposition, if I could, then I would. Now, freedom of action, on the other hand, is just the ability to actually move or act in accordance with the choice that you have made. So, as far as how these two technically are related to each other, we would say that freedom of choice is necessary for freedom of action, and freedom of action is sufficient for freedom of choice. So, as long as your actions are free, your choices are free, but your choices can be free without necessarily your actions being free. Now, another topic that takes up a lot of the literature is the extent to which, if at all, our having free will is compatible with determinism. So, the reason why this is a problem is if all events in the world are just determined, kind of like these billiard balls are here, it doesn't seem that there's much room for free will here. But when we're talking about determinism, what exactly are we talking about? So, to say a given event E is determined just means this: an event E is determined just in case E is necessitated by causal conditions which exist prior to E. And what we mean by necessitation is this. So if one event A necessitates another event B, then on the occurrence of A, B cannot possibly fail to occur. So with respect to these two events, A and B, if it's possible for A to happen and B to not happen, that means that A does not necessitate B, or A does not determine B. Okay, now what does this have to do with human action? Well, here's what this has to do with human action. So if determinism is true, then all events are determined. So that just goes by the definition of what determinism is. And all human actions are events. So human actions aren't identical to events, but human actions certainly constitute events. Well, it follows from 1 and 2, therefore, if determinism is true, then all human actions are determined. So based on the definition of determinism that we've given, that means that if determinism is true, then all human actions are necessitated by causal conditions which exist prior to those actions. So for example, I have my coffee cup here from, let me turn around, from the Frothy Monkey in Nashville and Franklin, Tennessee, where my brothers live. So I decided to make a cup of coffee prior to coming upstairs and recording this lecture. But if it was just a series of events leading up to my getting the cup of coffee, which necessitate that I'm going to get that cup of coffee, that means given all of those events happening in tandem, if determinism is true, I can't possibly fail to not get a cup of coffee. The outcome is determined by everything which happens prior to it. Okay, now you may be sitting there thinking, well, if all of my actions are just necessitated by prior existing causal conditions, then how exactly can I have free will? Well, that's a pressing issue. So, with respect to how determinism and free will are related, these are some of the positions that we can hold. So, first of all, a lot of philosophers are compatibilists about free will and determinism. This position is often called soft determinism as well. Okay, now, so whether or not we have free will, compatibilists will debate about. So, some compatibilists say we do have free will, some compatibilists say that we don't have free will, but this is what they all agree upon. Compatibilists all say that the truth of determinism is not enough to know whether or not we have free will or whether or not we lack free will. So compatibilists hold to this position. A world in which determinism is true is not necessarily a world in which we lack free will. So what that means is if determinism is true, it doesn't follow from that alone. It doesn't follow from that alone that we lack free will. That's why free will and determinism are compatible. And in the next video, I'll actually give a detailed argument in favor of compatibilism, which is popular among a lot of philosophers. All right, now several other philosophers are incompatibilists about free will and determinism. And incompatibilism would be any position equivalent to this: that a world in which determinism is true is necessarily a world in which we lack free will. So if you're a compatibilist, or I'm sorry, if you're an incompatibilist, you're going to say, no, if we know that determinism is true, it follows from that alone that we lack free will. None of our actions are going to be free. Okay, now obviously, incompatibilists can come in a couple of different varieties, as the reading from the textbook indicated. So here's the first option. The first option would be some kind of what's called hard determinism. So sometimes compatibilism, as I mentioned, is referred to as soft determinism. So this would be hard determinism. Okay, hard determinism would be the position that free will and determinism are incompatible, and determinism is true, therefore we lack free will. So free will and determinism are incompatible. Determinism is true, therefore we lack free will. Now, and if you are a hard determinist that thinks that some type of free will is necessary for moral responsibility, which a lot of philosophers do think that at least some kind of free will is necessary for moral responsibility. If you're a hard determinist who thinks that free will is necessary for moral responsibility, it would follow on the truth of determinism that none of us are morally responsible for our actions either. Okay, and then the other variety of incompatibilism would be libertarianism. Now, I've chosen this photo on the slide just to make a crucial point. What we're talking about here is known as metaphysical libertarianism. This has nothing to do with political libertarianism, sort of Ron Paul, lock yourself in the basement and the government's trying to take our guns, taxation is theft, all that sort of stuff. Metaphysical libertarianism and political libertarianism are completely different philosophies. You can affirm one without affirming the other. Okay, so the libertarian of a certain stripe would affirm these 3 points. So, first of all, free will and determinism are incompatible. Determinism is false, and some of our actions are free. So free will and determinism are incompatible. Determinism is false, and some of our actions are free. Okay, now you may be asking why I didn't write this phrasing here in argument form. Well, here's why. These are claims that the libertarian affirms. This is not an argument that some of our actions are free, and here is why. You can't prove that we have free will just by proving that determinism is false. The falsity of determinism is compatible with every single one of us lacking free will. So if you say the conditional, if determinism is true, then we don't have free will, the falsity of the antecedent of that conditional doesn't imply that it's consequent that we do not have free will is false. So one day I was in a coffee shop and there were two college students sitting there arguing about free will, and one of them said, well, if determinism is true, none of us have free will. And then the other one said, but determinism is false. So, and me being the kind of person I am, I couldn't help it. I turned and looked at them and I was like, yeah, so? So, yeah, if determinism is true, none of us have free will. Well, determinism is false, but logically speaking, it doesn't follow from that we have free will. So, this is essentially what the libertarian then has to do. The libertarian needs to give a compelling argument for incompatibilism, a compelling argument for the falsity of determinism, and then a separate argument, an independent argument that we actually have free will. But those are three completely different projects there. So this is a really crucial point. Simply proving determinism false, it does not follow that we actually have free will. So make sure you get that, especially if I ask you a question about it on the final exam. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this introductory video into the lecture material on free will, and you will probably see me in a couple of minutes wearing the same outfit. I'll see you then.